Good afternoon, everyone. So my talk is a little different here. Unlike Mr. Piramal's one, the large conglomerate, my talk is more on technology and the impact that it's going to have on two, I think, very important areas, marketing and politics. So if you look forward and you think through India in 2019, 2020, we're going to have 600 plus million smartphone users in India, one in every household in the country. Each one connected on high-speed data. It's going to be a very, very different world from the one we are seeing even today. Each one of these users with hundreds of social contacts, being able to send text, video, and so on, even faster than what we can do today. Mobile wallets, real-time money transfers, and each person with 3 times today's disposable income. And as GDP grows, disposable incomes are going to grow faster. Every kid will have a unique email and mobile number, of course, email and unique ID. A generation of youth, and especially the under 25s, who have grown up with the internet, really as part of them. When you talk to VCs today, you see them talking about entrepreneurs in their mid-20s, who have very little fear, very positive in their outlook, and that's really what's changing the face of entrepreneurship in India. On the other hand, you'll also have smart machines, the emerging area of the Internet of Things, where machines connected to each other through the internet with sensors everywhere. We are doing a project for a customer where we're automating the cold chain temperature sensing, so you can get alerts when temperature rises or falls significantly. So essentially, mobiles and high-speed networks with technology and data are going to bring about a significant difference and change and disruption going forward. So if we look at just 4 areas, what I think of as A, B, C, D, algorithms, automation, artificial intelligence, the blockchain. The Economist had a cover story on blockchain. It's the technology behind Bitcoins, and it's got huge applications even in the government space. For example, you could have land titling. Instead of using a centralized ledger, you have a trust-based distributed ledger. So multiple applications of technologies like this. The cloud, of course, and data. And you saw the impact of the cloud recently when Amazon, Google, and Microsoft announced earnings. The 3 companies saw their market cap increase by an aggregate of $100 billion on the next day after their earnings were announced. It's a huge shift which is happening to the cloud. And the D stands for data. You're seeing massive amounts of data being generated. Now, that's opening up newer areas into analytics and so on, and we'll talk about of that going forward. So if you see this landscape in technology, I think the 2 areas which are going to have significant impact from a business standpoint, according to me, are marketing and politics, and I'll cover both of these going forward. Essentially, in marketing, what you're seeing really is the age of the customer. The customer is now, for the first time, you have a digital connect to a customer. And there's a very good quote by Martha Rogers. In the absence of communication among your customers, advertising rules. Once your customers communicate with each other, it's the customer experience that counts. So this is becoming a significant shift also going forward. The customer is connected, mobile, social, and leaving data footprints, which are there for companies to basically analyze going forward. Now, what is the impact of this? If you look ahead, one of the most important areas is going to be that marketing, which so far hitherto has been really mass marketing, has to become more personalized, has to become digital, has to become targeted, has to become one-on-one. There's a very good quote by Ram Charan in his latest book, The Attacker's Advantage. With companies able to collect and control information on the entire experience of a customer, the math house now can focus on each customer as an individual. In a manner of speaking, we are evolving back to the artisan model, where a market segment comprises one individual. Many of us who have ordered, say, on Amazon.com, you get personalized recommendations. And that, again, increases loyalty going forward. So companies are going to start collecting the data, analyzing it, and then be able to come out with a customized experience for each of us going forward. The technology for making this is today available. You have Amazon Web Services, which can let you store and process massive amounts of data at probably 1/10 the cost of what it would have been about 3 or 4 years ago. So newer capabilities are really becoming possible, which otherwise were not there. And of course, there's the mobile phone, which changes everything. Earlier, it was very hard to reach customers individually. Now, you can get to people one-on-one. On a mobile phone with smartphones, pretty much everyone also has an email address. You're not just limited to an SMS or a voice call. More and more of us are checking emails. So rich media, rich content on mobile phones. So the traditional mass marketing channels essentially carried products with a mass appeal. Now you have this customization that because of the digital outreach that's becoming possible. And this is really the space which I think of as MarTech, marketing technology. And this is a very hot emerging space. You're going to see massive adoption of this in companies in India. And there are 5 key imperatives of marketing technology. And why this is important, because pretty much every company in the B2B or B2C space is going to be impacted by this. And I'll talk about that in a minute. There are 5 imperatives. The ability to collect data at every touch point. Mr. Piramal talked about his US company, DRG, which is in the healthcare data business. So even as companies which are in the offline, online space, how do you collect data at every touch point? And that data is today available because the customer is digital. Second, how do you create a unified view of a customer? So the ability to collect all of this data together to develop an integrated sort of persona of the individual. Third is then customizing the content, the communication that is there to a customer. I think that is very, very important. That is where you create a distinctive experience for individuals. The ability to communicate through multiple channels. Today you can reach customers via SMS, voice calls, emails, potentially WhatsApp messages, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. So there are multiple channels which are there to send out this targeted communication to people. And finally, being able to predict what the next step will, what the customer will do next. So predictive analytics, predictive marketing is going to be another space which is going to evolve rapidly going forward. And the outcome of this means that companies are going to have to change their internal org structures. So hitherto the functions of sort of the CIO and the CMO, which were separate, I think are going to get more and more merged together into what I think of as a chief marketing technologist, the CMT. Marketing now is no longer a technical, is no longer just a creative discipline, it's a technical discipline. Technology, data, the digital, the content, analytics all become important special areas that a CMO needs to understand. And as someone put it, it's not just madmen, but you need mathmen going forward. You really have to look at the rise of, you're looking at the rise of a marketing hacker. You know, you uses agile techniques to do iterations, just as you would do in software when you take products out to market. And you see some of the e-commerce companies actually doing that. Experiments, see what's working, you know, what they call A/B testing. So you send out some messages out, see what's working, and build on the messages which are working. Frequent experimentation, thus therefore becomes possible. And essentially, the future now is going to belong to mass personalization. So these were old ideas which had been talked about 10, 20 years ago, but now you have technology which really is going to make this possible. What does this do for companies? What you're seeing really is a massive disruption that's coming. We saw that in the world of advertising over the last 10 odd years with the emergence of the internet. You are now seeing that with one of the most important functions in a company, which is marketing. So what you're going to see is that companies which can integrate technology into the core of what they are doing, especially on the marketing function, have the ability to essentially get a disproportionate value creation happening going forward. So this is a disruption coming out in the space, and then it'll play out over the next 4-5 years. And this is also a time when value destruction and creation happens. So companies which are savvy at using technology to create distinctive experiences for customers, I think are going to be big, big beneficiaries. You're seeing an industry which has pretty much been the same, marketing, over the last, say, 100 odd years, now being disrupted through technology. So keeping a sense of what's happening with all these technologies and the customer experience, because the customer has changed, is changing dramatically. I mean, as I said earlier, you're going to have 60 crore smartphones in India, one in every household in the next 4 or 5 years. What does that do to business? What does that do to the way you are going to sell? How does that change outreach? How does that change your marketing messages that need to go out? Because you're also getting data back, so you can now do customization. So that's the world of marketing, I think how it's going to change through technology. The second theme I want to take up is on the political space. I think a very important space, because we are seeing a significant impact of that on businesses going forward. So the way I look at elections in India, there are basically two types of elections. There's one election which is sort of fought at which is a summation of state elections, which is fought on sort of local issues. A lot of caste, religion tends to dominate that. And in the period from sort of 1989 to 2009, most of the national elections in India tended to be like that, a summation of state elections. The second type of election, where is it fought at one level higher up. So it becomes a national type of an issue. And I think there are sort of two themes on which this can be done. One is built around sort of a better life tomorrow, development, as was the theme. The second path could be around what again, it was tried by different parties over the interim sort of 20 years, either based on identity, sort of a Hindu identity, or sort of secularism, whichever way one looks at it. Parties have to decide where to play. And in 2014, in fact, as of course BJP chose the development theme, and that is where they reached numbers which were unthinkable, even a year before the national election. The maximum seats that the BJP had ever won uniquely over its history since 1980 were 299 out of the 543 seats. And then to deliver a performance which wins them 282 seats is absolutely remarkable. So again, 2019, I think it's going to be substantially different from the way elections in 2014 were. Just as the BJP looked at a mission 272 plus, I think they or the Congress will need to look at what I think of as mission 40 plus, basically targeting a 40% vote share in elections. Now, if you actually look at elections, state elections in India and even at the national level, in effect, in the US, you have a pretty well set out two-party system, so you need close to 50% to really be the winner. In India, you have almost 20% vote in election after election, which goes to smaller parties, independents, and so on. So effectively, I think the Lakshman Rekha is really somewhere around 40. Even if you look at the BR elections, it seemed to be bipolar. But BJP got 34, or the NDA got 34%, the Mahagathbandhan got 42, 76. 24% votes went out to smaller parties, independents, etc., which barely won a handful of seats between them. So the winning marker, I think, is going to be 40%, because you're going to have sort of consolidations of parties into one of these two sort of coalitions, as it were. So that's, I think, the focus. 40% vote share, I think, becomes very, very important to target in an election. Because as others are finding out now, that the BJP basically can reach maybe 35% on its own, maybe a little bit more with allies, depending on how it plays out. But if they all combine together, they can get close to the 40% mark. So it's a race towards, I think, 40%. And that's going to be played out going forward. The second theme is that just as social media was a big factor, especially WhatsApp and so on, in the 2014 elections, I think in the elections going forward, the app is going to be very critical. And I don't think political parties have yet started understanding the full potential or the opportunity of what this does. I see the election 2019 going forward as, it's a race also to getting to about 10 crore app installs or users for a party, just like in the e-commerce companies, where you have a race to get the apps on people's phones installed and then, of course, continuously used. You need that. BJP got 17 crore voters in 2019. For them to be able to reach out, one approach is, of course, you have the mass media, you have the rallies, etc. But with a population which is changing, evolving, becoming more urbanized, less interested in trying to go out on massive fields to listen to speeches. I think the app again becomes very important. Some of the ideas that we talked about earlier on marketing, therefore play out here also. In that sense, BJP's membership drive, which basically got them 10 crore members through a missed call and then subsequent request to send further information, I think is very important. What BJP's challenge would be is to convert this into essentially app users. So you can have a direct connect, you can then personalize the messaging going forward, and so on. You're going to also see a lot of use of election data for targeting and getting out the vote campaigns. This is how a lot of US elections tend to play out, and I think you're going to see much more of that because there's a lot more, again, data available, especially if you have the app presence on people's phones. And essentially, again, not very different from any other corporate sort of customer, a B2C customer, where KYC, knowing your customer, is, I think, very important. I think political parties will also tend to do that because the 18 or 20-year-old is probably going to vote differently, has different aspirations than a 30-year-old or a 50-year-old. I think the UP 2017 elections could be the first of this new type of elections. Again, you're looking at in India, 18 months on, you'll have 4G rollouts which would have started. You'll have much better networks, of course, and you'll have much larger installed base of phones. I mean, just where the story is, India is going to have, or is crossing the threshold of 40 crore, 400 million internet users. And you'll see something similar, probably 300 plus or 350 million smartphone users by that time. So data, technology, MarTech, all of them, I think, also get applied in the political space, with one significant difference. In the political space, really, there are no prizes for coming second. I mean, you have 5 years to worry if you have lost even by a single vote. So market share doesn't really count as much as sort of a winner-take-all scenario. And again, there are very interesting applications of this. I mean, one of the things that we had tried to do during the 2014 election was doing polling in UP and Bihar. We used to do continuous polling, and we would send out people physically to the doorstep of a selected set of voters. So we would identify about 1,500 people per parliamentary constituency, and a human being would actually go to them, ask them a set of questions. Now, this is a very expensive process. It's typically the way opinion polls are also done today. Now, the challenge there is the cost of doing this is large. It comes to almost 150 rupees a person. And the time taken to get feedback is quite long. You don't have the same sort of reaction time. Now, in a world where everyone pretty much has a mobile phone, everyone is reachable, and especially if you can start building up profiles of people, sort of the voter rolls become a starting point, the digitized voter rolls become a starting point, link them up with mobile numbers, then you can do surveys at scale. And I want to give you a small example of something we had done recently for the Ministry of Petroleum, just to give you an idea of what becomes possible. Should get a call, just a...
प्रिय एलपीजी उपभोक्ता, हम भारत सरकार की ओर से ये सर्वे कर रहे हैं। इस सर्वे का उद्देश्य सब्सिडी भुगतान और गैस सिलेंडर के वितरण को और आसान करना है। क्या आप पहल योजना से संतुष्ट हैं? यदि आप संतुष्ट हैं तो 1 दबाएं। यदि आप संतुष्ट नहीं हैं तो 2 दबाएं। यदि आप नहीं जानते तो 3 दबाएं। पिछले महीने सब्सिडी आपके बैंक खाते में कितने दिनों में पहुंची थी? 2 वर्किंग दिनों के लिए 1 दबाएं। 2 से 5 वर्किंग दिनों के लिए 2 दबाएं। 5 वर्किंग दिनों से ज्यादा के लिए 3 दबाएं। पहल योजना से जुड़ने के बाद सिलेंडर की डिलीवरी में क्या असर पड़ा है? यदि ये पहले की तुलना में बेहतर है तो...
So you get the idea. We were asked by the Ministry of Petroleum to survey 1% of the 14 crore Pahel, the direct beneficiaries, the DBT transfer, in basically a week's time. Okay, so 14 lakh people. Now you can't do this through call centers and whatever else. This was done through an automated program, local languages, and we delivered the results in basically, I think, 8 days or so. Now, this is something which can be done on a regular basis. the cost of a survey like this essentially works out to about 2 to 3 rupees. Out of 100 calls that we make, maybe about 10 people will answer the phone, and out of them maybe 2 or 3 will actually fill up the questions. We had 5 questions in all. It would take a minute and a half. It's an incoming call, so it's free to the user. It's in your local language. You hear Bharat Sarkar right up front, so you tend to listen and answer. Now imagine being able to collect feedback on this, on government programs, on what stands parties should take on specific issues at scale. I think this sort of strengthens democracy. It gives people also a feedback mechanism. Same ideas, of course, can be used in the corporate world, but just to show that how technology can really change things when you start assuming that every person has a mobile phone. So opinion polls, and we saw some of the outcomes in the Bihar election, some of the, instead of surveying 5,000, 10,000 people, imagine if you could survey 100 times that number. And if you knew a little bit about each person, age, gender, etc., and location, then you can have very, very good sort of analytics on the way things are moving on the ground. I think why all of this matters, basically because in the political space, really, the parties are targeting everyone over 18 years of age. And that's 100 crore Indians at a national level. Political campaigns tend to be path-breaking. Just like in the US now, we are seeing that in India, that they tend to be pioneering in the use of technology because there's no prizes for coming second. It's sort of winner-take-all scenario. So you want to deploy everything. Money typically doesn't end up being a constraint for innovative ideas and for the outreach that's there. Another very interesting angle in this is that in the 2019 election, you're going to have, I think, 15 crore new voters need to get registered. So it's going to be a significant difference. Now, where does this number come from? From the analysis that we had done in the age group of 18 to 24, half the voters are not registered in India. So they are not there on the electoral rolls. So that number comes out to almost 7.5 crore. And you have another 7.5 crore, which is the 15 to 17-year-olds today, who will be eligible to vote in 2019. So you have, out of the 100 crore base, you will have 15 crore people who will be voting for the first time, if they are all persuaded to get registered. And that's a very large number. Again, that's going to make a huge difference in the outcome of elections going forward. Another idea which I've been thinking about is, how do you make political parties or governments basically do the right things? You can think of creating voting blocks now. So the idea of a voting block is basically multiple people come together and essentially say that, look, not only are we going to vote in the next election, but we are going to vote as one. Now, if you can get 10% of the people in a constituency together to be part of a voting block, you may not be able to make someone win, but you can definitely make someone lose. The winning margin typically in elections is about 10%. Now, thinking of this 4 or 5 years ago would have been impossible. How do you coordinate the collective action of a large of 10% in a constituency? But again, with apps, you can actually make something like this happen. If you just look at the last 4 or 5 years and how our lives have changed, how we shop, how we travel, and so on. Now apply some of these ideas in a forward-looking manner to new spaces. Like the political space is something which I think is ripe for disruptive innovation, where you can give real-time feedback. There's an idea which I've been thinking about, that when a new government takes over, people do their voting thing and that's it. There is no way to really give the government feedback. Are you doing the right thing? Will we vote for you again or not? Because the solution is not voting out one government after another. How do you get prosperity? How do you get people on the path to prosperity? How do you get the government to do the right things? Imagine if a large number of people had an app on their phone which has 3 questions. First question, who are you? So enter your voter ID, and with the voter ID you can get name, gender, location, etc., all of that. Second is, whom did you vote for in the last election? Third question, the answer to which can be changed at any point of time. If elections were to be held tomorrow, whom will you vote for? Now, to leaders in power, this becomes a real-time feedback mechanism. If, as a minister or a chief minister or a prime minister, I know that there's a negative swing against me for 5 to 7%, then I'm going to be forced to do the right things. I'm going to be forced to change the track at least of what I'm doing. So these things become possible. You can then do feedback like we saw with the survey earlier at scale. So I think what these technologies can do is create a much more participative democracy where people coming together can put pressure to get the right outcomes and get, probably faster growth as we go forward. So key points to summarize, I think, is that marketing across industries, I think, is going to be transformed because of what we talked about, data, technology, etc. So you have automation, predictive analytics, all these new areas which are coming up, I think are going to make a significant difference in targeting across spaces, across industries going on. The ones who adopt them earlier, I think, have a substantial chance of leadership in industries. And watch politics for really early examples of how some of these technologies and methods can really be deployed. And all that happens, I think, in politics, of course, has perhaps the greatest impact on the theme of this conference, a stock called India. Thank you. We'll take questions now.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks, Rajesh. Sorry. Thank you, Rajesh. That was very helpful. I guess, what you've sort of talked about is what I think sort of the third derivative, or the second derivative in terms of reaching out and getting people to vote and so on and so forth. And I guess the first thing is really that, our people's lives better. I mean, of course, it's a very short, we've had since 18 months since this government has come. But I'm just wondering that what needs to happen in UP in 2017 post Bihar? And are there any lessons that the BJP government needs to draw upon to reverse, what happened in Bihar?
I think one of the key things is really staying on message. If you actually looked at Bihar and the pre-poll and the post-poll surveys that were there, the pre-poll surveys, and this was, I think, done in the August or early September timeframe by Lokniti CSDS, actually showed BJP 4% ahead. And in the outcome, BJP or the NDA was 8% behind. So there was a big shift which happened in the election. I think the election started off with a focus around development, which is BJP's sort of strong point, but somewhere it got shifted to being a caste-based election. And we used to talk about this in the run-up even to 2014, that if the voting is really at the caste level, then as I said earlier, it becomes very difficult to win. There has to be one level higher up. The theme has to be one level higher up. There has to be a larger unifying theme that has to be there. And I think in retrospect, perhaps BJP should have stuck to the theme around development, what you said earlier, a better life for people, jobs, and so on. And a positive sort of message. And I think that's probably the lesson, the learning which should be there in UP also. So I think it's two parts to it. See, elections are both about, there's a sort of message which is there, again, not very different from the world of FMCG products, perhaps. There's a larger marketing message which needs to be consistent. So everyone has to speak sort of the same language across channels, across people. And then there has to be a grassroots sort of organization which has to, on election day, get the voters out. I think that's very, very important. So you need to combine message with an election day getting out the vote campaign. And that needs to be preceded by a contact program. You need to create awareness and so on. So you need the ground forces also. And these things have to be put in place much earlier. The grassroots presence needs to be built up over time. But I think the messaging is very, very important. I think the theme probably for the BJP should be to stick to the core message. I think another theme that people have talked about, and I think which I would tend to agree, is the need for local leaders. I think it's very, very important. I think in India what's happening more and more is that people are voting also for someone they can hold responsible, they can hold accountable. Of course, this argument cuts both ways because parties have won elections without having a face. But I think in a very sort of media-centric world, which is where we are getting to, I think having a local face, I think it's very, very important. That comes with its own challenges because there are multiple calculations which have to be taken care of. Again, parties tend to look at caste and so on. You also want to make every leader who has its own constituency work. So by not declaring a candidate, everyone tends to work. So these are challenges which I think have to be addressed. But I think overall the theme has to be around a positive message, an aspirational future which is there. I think linking that with essentially a message, especially for the young voters. I think most important today is jobs, really. How will my life be better tomorrow? And that's going to be linked with jobs.
Thanks. The other thing was that I was on a road show in the US last month, and a couple of the large institution clients, they basically said that the leadership is spending a lot of time overseas and not enough time on domestic issues, which is really where the focus should be. And of course that cuts both ways. But is it that now our understanding is that post the UK trip, there's going to be, from your vantage point, more of a focus on domestic issues, and sort of Bihar is a bit of a wake-up call?
See, I think it's if you actually see going forward, and I have no inside information, so that's sort of a disclaimer, so I'm giving my own assessment. See, I think is that the reality in India is that the NPA problem, I think, is very, very serious. This has been pointed out, the stressed assets in the system are large. I don't think, my personal belief is not enough has really been done to de-stress the system. So the ability of domestic companies to invest is that much, I think, more limited, unless there is sort of drastic action which needs to be taken, which I think requires a lot of political courage. You got to take on the bank unions. People have talked about various solutions, the need for consolidation. Do we really need 26, 27 public sector banks? The need for creating a bad bank, need for bringing in professional management, and so on. And I think unless some of these actions are taken, you are not going to get domestic investment moving fast enough. And that's one. Second is, I think you also need international investments, therefore, coming into India. And I think you're seeing that with these trips, building up India's global image, I think is very, very important. It's in a way, how, say, the CEOs of some of the large companies which have global sort of businesses, CEOs do tend to travel a lot and meet with customers internationally. And I think typically I think why this criticism is there, because we see the Prime Minister going out and on multiple trips. But I think that also Prime Minister is just one, it's the head of the government. I think you still have the whole bureaucracy, you have the ministers, etc., who are pretty much there. So I think really in India there are a couple of things which are required to really get the economy moving. One is, I think, on the NPA issue, I think needs much more substantive action. And second, I think, is that, again, friends, people who understand this is a lot better, I think have spoken about this in my interactions with people from the financial community, that the real estate sector, I think, has to become one of the engines of growth, real estate and infrastructure. Railways basically accounts for 1% of gross fixed capital formation. The real estate sector is at 20 to 25%. What drove a lot of the growth in the NDA1 was infrastructure and real estate at that time. And I think in their interest rates, etc., there are multiple factors which all come together. But if you want a large-scale sort of unskilled labor job or unskilled jobs, I think it's going to come from the real estate sector. So that, I think, has to be done. So these are, I think, two big actions which need to be taken. They need domestic action, But in many of these cases, perhaps, there will be investments also coming in from global. And there's a significant global opportunity, I think, which is there for India to absorb investment. And the Prime Minister's visits, I think, are sort of building India's image abroad. I think will definitely go a long way towards helping these investments come in.
Thanks. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Michael. Mihir.
Just a bit away from political questions. How far are we on the learning curve as far as the government and the tax authorities are concerned on the cyber law, the taxation, etc. are concerned for e-commerce and of course IT security, etc. Because you keep hearing headlines about, there's still controversies about sales tax and stuff like that, service tax, etc. for e-com companies. And of course, cyber laws are still fuzzy. So what's your call on that?
So I don't have any other knowledge than what one reads in the press, sort of. So I'm not an insider in that sense. So it's very hard for me to comment on that. But I think there is one thing which I will want to say on this. Given that I think a week ago, in a spate of 48 hours, 3 taxes were increased. You had a 2% cess which came in on airline tickets, you had service tax which went up by 0.5%, and you had excise duties on petrol which were raised. And it reminded me of a comment made by Ronald Reagan, when people had gone to him when he was president about some tax increases. And he said, what makes you think that we in government will be able to spend that money better than citizens themselves can? And I think it's a question we should be asking in India also. Because if you see over the last year, we've seen service tax go up, if you add this, over 2%. We don't know what the GST number is going to come up with. You've seen excise on petrol raised substantially, excise duties and so on. So what if that money was left in the pockets of people? Could that have made a big difference? Could that have helped to sort of drive the economy forward faster? In general, I think the challenge in India is that we have, I think, too much of government and too limited freedom. I mean, we tend to sort of get government involved in many places, like I think...
Sorry, my question was more on the taxation treatment of e-commerce transactions and stuff like that.
I said that part I don't have inside knowledge. I'm just talking about the broader issue on taxation. So I'll stop here then.
That's fine. Thank you. And the other thing is, you are one of the original e-commerce or info, whatever you call it, cyber... Internet kind of entrepreneurs, but we haven't seen anything from you recently. Yeah, so... in this space.
Yeah, so I'd sold my business in 99.
Yeah.
And we did quite well with the exit. We took cash for the most part of it. I think so I haven't done anything in the sort of B2C space, because I think over time the B2C space has changed significantly. My company netCORE works primarily on the B2B space, so sort of the digital communications and so on. I think in the B2C space, I think the shift that has happened is that the focus tends to be more on rapidly raising capital and then going down the path of sort of customer acquisition at whatever cost. And I think that's a very hard business to sustain. So it's really, over time, I think companies are going to have to look very seriously at how they're going to build profitable businesses. But having said that, the flip side of the positive side of this is, I think what we've seen is massive growth in India in entrepreneurs, which I think is going to be fantastic for the country going forward. Success and failure are two sides of the same coin. I failed multiple times before I sort of succeeded with India World. So I think that's great. Once people become entrepreneurs, I think they're going to stay entrepreneurs. So they're going to take the learnings from one venture and take it on to the next. And I think second is it's driven technology adoption, mobile adoption, in a much faster way than was probably imaginable 3 or 4 years ago. So I think both of these are going to be great foundations for India going forward. So the specific, so that's why my belief is that personally, I like to run profitable businesses. It's very difficult to run today profitable businesses in the B2C space, the way things are.
So you haven't done any angel investing or something like that?
Pardon?
You haven't done any angel investing or
Yeah, I tried that 6 to 7 years ago, and I realized I didn't like it. I realized I'm better at doing my own thing, so investing in my own business. And I also tend to spend a lot more time now on thinking on how we can transform India. So how do you the voting block idea that is there. Another idea that I have is that the root of the problem in India goes down to the constitution. I believe that the rules of the game matter in India, and we need a new constitution in India, so new rules of the game. So can we use technology, etc., change people's minds and get a new second republic really created in India in the next 4 to 5 years?
Thank you.
Yeah, Rajesh, this is Sashi here. I had 2 questions, one on the digital connect and the other on the political connect.
Yes.
As far as the digital connect, in the financial services business, we've been talking about, predictive analysis, propensity mapping, and a lot of that stuff. But the dichotomy, I think, is broadly in 2 things which you talked about. One is the customized experience, and the other is the mass personalization. We wonder where we are getting. Are we getting to a customized experience, or are we getting to a mass personalization? I just wanted to get your idea on that.
Okay, so what I mean there is that essentially, think of, if I go back to the Ram Charan quote, it's basically about a virtual sales rep. See, every person likes to be treated differently. It's not possible most of the time because you don't know. When I walk into a crossword, excuse me, they have no idea who I am. Maybe in a few years' time, if they have beacons there, if they can sense through their app on my phone that I am actually at the crossword and it's me, I can get a message right away saying that, Rajesh, since you came last time, based on your purchase history, these are the 5 books which you would be interested in. Here is their shelf numbers where they are. And if you buy them right now, there's maybe a 5% discount for you. So when I say it's the ability to customize content, but do that at scale, not through individual salespeople, but through using technology. That's, I think, the way it's going to play out.
Yeah, and the second question I had was on the political connect. Anyway, congratulations to you, Mahesh and Prashant and all these guys, friends of BJP. But the worry is that as much as you can influence the voter, you can also manipulate the voter because you've got so much of information. How do we, prevent that from happening?
See, I think people are pretty much smart. The same thing applies in the consumer space, as it were. So companies do tend to have information. There's a fine line between, I think people realize it when they are being manipulated. I think if you look at Indian elections history, we have tended to have fragmented polities. You have too many parties and so on. But I think over the last 5-6 years, if you look at elections post-2009, I think except for perhaps twice, I think Uttarakhand and Delhi 2013, pretty much every election has delivered a decisive verdict in favor of one party or the other. And in fact, even in Bihar, when I used to talk about it to people, I said, look, I don't know which way the outcome is going to be, but I think it's going to be 2:1. One party is going to win big. Even UP, which had 4 parties contesting in the last election. So I think voters are pretty much smart. They have access to a lot more information now. And it's not just what is controlled through what the media channels are or the government sources are. I think the growth of WhatsApp is remarkable in that sense. And you're going to only see this increase going forward. So people have their own sources. I think they cannot be manipulated. And I think as long as there's more information going out to voter, I think you're going to have perhaps better decisions taking place in who to vote for. I think that's been a bit of a problem in the past in India. So more information, I think is going to be good in the political context.
So you mean to say the digital voter is a discerning voter?
Digital voter?
He's a discerning voter. He can actually figure out.
See, also I said there are 2 parts to this. I think at one level, a single vote really doesn't make any difference. So in an outcome of an election, there have been various books written on this. Brian Kaplan has written a book that it's actually irrational to vote. because your single vote only comes into play when you have both sides or both candidates with the same number of votes, and then you go and do the casting vote. So in effect, you're either helping reduce someone's margin or increase someone's margin of victory as a single voter. And yet people vote. So what they are saying is it's basically irrational to vote. It also means that people spend less time thinking about their voting decision than they would say versus buying a phone. And ironically, if you see in the tier of the 3 elections, the corporator is actually the most important when it comes to daily life, for the services that are on offer. And we tend to have the lowest voting and the least thinking as to who the corporator is or even the sort of MLA is. And we tend to make a big deal out of national elections. So I think one big change in India which is happening is as more and more devolution of money takes place down the local level, down to the states, and hopefully down to the next level. I think you need a lot more information available for decision making. You need greater involvement from citizens, because at the end of the day, we are living in neighborhoods, we are living in this country. I think we have to get more involved to create a better future for ourselves, whether it's roads, whether it's the schools around, whether it's the open spaces and so on. It's eventually we who are responsible. You can't hold others sort of, because politicians who are there in politics are there for their self-interest, just as we do in the marketplace, what James Buchanan has basically said. So there's no difference. They focus on their self-interest as we focus on our self-interest in the marketplace. Their self-interest is getting re-elected. A bureaucrat's self-interest is increasing turf and increasing the budgets. So they are not there out, they don't just become saints, once they go into politics. So you need to have, I think, people pressure. And that's where some of the technologies which are there, I think, can let people sort of self-organize and therefore put little more pressure, put constitutional constraints on the size of government.
Sure, thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, Rajesh bhai, my name is Jigar Savla, and if you can share some of your insights on how would the technology disruptions be affecting the financial industry, financial services.
Just come again. Which technology? The echo is there, so
Yeah, the technology or the whatever is happening in the technology world would be having its impact on the financial services industry in terms of disruptions. Yes, thanks.
So I think one that we spoke about earlier has really is around data. I think in the financial sector, I think that this applies to not just the BFSI segment but across. And we interact with a lot of BFSI customers and netCORE for some of the services. I think collecting data and knowing about your customer, I think, is very, very important. I think even if you cannot customize or personalize the experience that is possible today, collecting data at every touch point, I think, is very, very critical. That's the starting point for going forward. Second is, I think companies have to imagine how things are going to be when pretty much every one of your users is going to be on smartphone across the board. And that's the India we are moving towards. So just as the e-commerce companies have realized it, I think the BFSI segment needs to realize it. Because I think what you're seeing now is a blurring of borders between the businesses that companies are going to do. I think a CEO of one of the large US banks was asked recently as to what do you worry about. He says, my worry is the outsiders in our industry. What will companies like Google, Apple, etc. do, which can impact our industries? So it is not necessarily going to be another financial services company. Today, with the emergence of sort of payment banks, e-commerce companies, the mobile wallet companies, your competition can come from anywhere. They all have customer data. They have customer relationships. For them to be able to expand the portfolio of their services also becomes possible tomorrow. So I think the ability to adopt technology, I think, is very important, and it has to become central. And therefore, the marketing technologist or the CIO has to have a seat at the top table, I think, in companies. I mean, the latest story in Fortune magazine, Businessman of the Year, is on the Nike CEO, the CEO of Nike. And one of the quotes in that story, or I think there was a summary of that in Fortune online, was that behind every company is a disruptive technology. So as every successful company. So you, for example, when you think of blockchains, bitcoins, what can the impact be of not just the technology, but also of these cryptocurrencies which are there. So I think companies are going to have to start thinking a little further ahead in terms of new emerging technologies like these. I mean, earlier there were huge investments being made internally in servers, etc. Today, you can probably get a lot of this at a fraction in the cloud. You look at what Amazon, Google, Microsoft are offering in the cloud. So now for a competitor with no legacy, okay, they can probably start competing at a fraction of the cost. So competition can come from other industries. The competitors are basically much faster, savvier because they don't have the legacy. I think so that's how you have to start thinking about the spaces because of technology. But I would say that as a starting point, I think the ability to there are a lot of existing customers which are there. How can you use data to cross-sell? How can you use how can you use the internet and mobile technologies for new customer acquisition? I think those are two very good low-hanging fruits which are there. So your next customer likely to be digital. How do you reach out and acquire that person? And your existing customers, how can you use emails, mobile phones with the data that, SMSs or whatever, with the data that you have to cross-sell and upsell to them. So from the same customer, you get a lot more. Otherwise, someone else is going to go after that customer.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Any more? Govind?
Hi, my name is Simone. My question would be that netCORE Solutions would be working in close hands with many analytics companies. Now, big data analytics have come a long way from where it was. Now, one point what you mentioned was collecting information from customers at every touch point. Now, if we are productively being able to interpret the information that we collect, then we'll be able to use it more productively in our marketing campaigns. So how far along have we come from where we used to be when it comes to analyzing the data that we collect?
See, I think the big challenge that we've seen in interacting with companies is that data still tends to be, so there are two big challenges. First is that data is still not being collected at every touch point. So for example, on the web or through the app, data collection is, I think, the first sort of important point. Second is that the data needs to then be aggregated together. So data, even when it's collected, tends to stay in silos. So creating a unified customer view, I think, is very, very important. So whether it's a person walking in, say, in a bank, at a branch, or online, or through an app, are we collecting all the data? When a message is sent to the customer, if there is a link in the message, that link, the click on that link, is it a personalized link so you can track who it is that is clicking on that email or that mail or the message that has been sent? So being able to collect all of this data and unify it across different products, like in many organizations which I've found, is that the company is selling like 10 different products, and the databases for each of these are separate. So the ability to know a customer well by connecting perhaps the mobile number and the email ID across this, so using that as a common key, which then lets you build up a much better integrated view. I think those are the two initial challenges out of the 5 that I had mentioned. I think if one starts with these two, later is the problem of analytics, the customization of the content, and then doing predictive analytics later. But the first step is building the unified customer view. I think that's the first key challenge to look at.
You mentioned about adoption, banks wanting to adopt new technologies. If you could actually, in your own interactions, speak about which banks are actually really adopting this as an opportunity and a challenge, and who are actually not really taking the note of this.
So it's hard to talk about specifics, but I think if you look at sort of anecdotal evidence, I think the private sector banks have actually been big adopters of technology. Way back, I think many years ago, HDFC Bank used to have, and I'm sure they still do, They're one of the early adopters of analytics, of doing testing on campaigns, which were going out to people, being able to track the results of campaigns. And my sense is that even some of the newer banks which are coming up, this is going to be embedded in their DNA. Because if you are you're creating an entity sort of afresh, you have to make technology at the core of what you're creating. I think the key is, how do you sort of look ahead? I don't yet see banks sort of adopting, say, cloud technologies. There are questions on data security, etc., of putting stuff out in the cloud. And my sense is, over time, a lot of these things are going to go away. I mean, you look at the pace of innovation that's happening on Amazon Web Services, for example. It is absolutely phenomenal. I don't think it's really going to disrupt enterprise software in an unbelievable manner. I think you look at companies like IBM and others, HP, and how they have performed in the past few years. It's been sort of quite disappointing, and they have to evolve themselves. But you look at Amazon, Google, Microsoft, the kind of stuff that's happening in the cloud. You have today technologies or software which would probably cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars or so to buy, which you can basically rent at maybe hundreds of dollars a month, which then gives you capabilities in terms of storage, in terms of massive parallel data processing, which were not possible earlier. I mean, when we had done work in the 2014 elections, we had digitized the electoral rolls. We had processed 1 million PDFs of the electoral data to extract out names, addresses for doing the campaign. And if we had to do it on our own servers, it would have probably cost us 20 to 30 times, which would have made the project unviable to begin with. But you put this out into the cloud, and you have pretty much unlimited capacity of how much you're willing to pay, unlimited capacity, be able to handle peaks, and get outcomes which were unthinkable earlier. So I think, how do you rethink, if you're a bank or a financial services company, I think being able to think through and imagine a new world that's getting created 3 to 4 years hence. And the starting point should be the customer. My customer in 3 to 4 years is going to be on a 4G or a 5G network with phones better than what any of us are using now, but new capabilities on the phones. I need to have a presence there. All transactions are going to happen from there. Now, how is it that I can, my competitors are going to do the same thing. So how is it that I can make that experience better? How can I anticipate what the customer is going to do next? How can I create a unique experience? Because the percentage of interest rates, the percentage of what it's going to cost for a trade, etc., are all going to be the same, pretty much across the board. I mean, that's a competitive marketplace there. But how do you use this as the customer experience as a distinguishing factor? I mean, the Fortune article, when you read it, there's an astonishing statistic in there. Nike's share of the US athletic shoe market is 62%. The second highest is 5% or less than 5%. I mean, you would have thought that in these kinds of physical world products that people buy, shoes and all, you are not going to have a winner-take-all type of market, with 13 times your next competitor. But they have built in technology, the way they have used technology, the way they have built in that whole customer experience is absolutely phenomenal. And that's what's going to, I think, separate winners from losers going forward.
Thank you.
Any more questions? We just have a round of applause for Rajesh. Rajesh, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your time and effort. Thank you.
Thanks.